Section 12 of The Arrivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Om123. The Arrivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. Madame Sara by L. T. Meade and Robert Eustace. Part 2. The reception in Portland Place was, I remember, on the 26th of July. 2 days later, the Selbys were to give their final at home before leaving for the country. I was, of course, invited to be present, and Madame was also there. She had never been dressed more splendidly, nor had she ever before looked younger or more beautiful. Wherever she went, all eyes followed her. As a rule, her dress was simple, almost like what a girl would wear. But tonight she chose rich oriental stuffs made of many colors and absolutely glittering with gems. Her golden hair was studded with diamonds. Round her neck she wore turquoise and diamonds mixed. There were many younger women in the room, but none the youngest nor the fairest had a chance beside Madame. It was not mere beauty of appearance, it was charm which carries all before it. I saw Miss Dallas, looking slim and tall and pale, standing at a little distance. I made my way to her side. Before I had time to speak, she bent towards me. "Is she not divine?" she whispered. "She bewilders and delights everyone. She is taking London by storm." "Then you are not afraid of her tonight?" I said. "I fear her more than ever. She has cast a spell over me. But listen, she is going to sing again." I had not forgotten the song that Madame had given us at the Farringdons, and stood still to listen. There was a complete hush in the room. Her voice floated over the heads of the assembled guests in a dreamy Spanish song. Edith told me that it was a slumber song, and that Madame boasted of her power of putting almost anyone to sleep who listened to her rendering of it. "She has many patients who suffer from insomnia," whispered the girl, "and she generally cures them with that song, and that alone. Ah, we must not talk. She will hear us." Before I could reply, Selby came hurrying up. He had not noticed Edith. He caught me by the arm. "Come just for a minute into this window, Dixon," he said. "I must speak to you. I suppose you have no news with regard my brother-in-law." "Not a word," I answered. "To tell you the truth, I am getting terribly put out over the matter. We cannot settle any of our money affairs just because this man chooses to lose himself. My wife's lawyers wired to Brazil yesterday, but even his bankers do not know anything about him." "The whole thing is a question of time," was my answer. "When are you off to Hampshire?" "On Saturday." As Selby said the last words, he looked around him. Then he dropped his voice. "I want to say something else. The more I see," he nodded towards Madame Sara, "the less I like her. Edith is getting into a very strange state. Have you not noticed it? And the worst of it is my wife is also infected. I suppose it is the dodge of the omens for patching people up and making them beautiful. Doubtless the temptation is overpowering in the case of a plain omen. But Beatrice is beautiful herself and young. What can she have to do with cosmetics and complexion pills?" "You don't mean to tell me that your wife has consulted Madame Sara as a doctor?" "Not exactly, but she has gone to her about her teeth. She complained of toothache lately, and Madame's dentistry is renowned. Edith is constantly going to her for one thing or another. But then Edith is infatuated." As Jack said the last words, he went over to speak to someone else, and before I could leave the seclusion of the window, I perceived Edith Dallas and Madame Sara in earnest conversation together. I could not help overhearing the following words: "Don't come to me tomorrow. Get into the country as soon as you can. It is far and away the best thing to do." As Madame spoke, she turned softly and caught my eyes. She bowed, and the peculiar look, the sort of challenge she had given me before, flashed over her face. It made me uncomfortable, and during the night that followed I could not get it out of my head. I remembered what Selby had said with regard to his wife and her money affairs. Beyond doubt he had married into a mystery that Madame knew all about. There was very big money interest, and strange things happen when millions are concerned. The next morning I had just risen and was sitting at breakfast when a note was handed to me. It came by special messenger, and was marked urgent. I tore it open. These were its contents: "My dear Druce, a terrible blow has fallen on us. My sister-in-law, Edith, was taken suddenly ill this morning at breakfast. The nearest doctor was sent for, but he could do nothing, as she died half an hour ago. Do come and see me, and if you know any very clever specialist, bring him with you. My wife is utterly stunned by the shock. Yours, Jack Selby. I read the note twice before I could realize what it meant. Then I rushed out and, hailing the first hansom I met, said the man, "Drive to number 192, Victoria Street, as quickly as you can." Here lived a certain Mr. Eric Vandeleur, an old friend of mine and the police surgeon for the Westminster district, which included Eaton Square. No shrewder or sharper fellow existed than Vandeleur, and the present case was essentially in his province, both legally and professionally. He was not at his flat when I arrived, having already gone down to the court. Here I accordingly hurried, and was informed that he was in the mortuary. For a man who, as it seemed to me, lived in a perpetual atmosphere of crime and violence, of death and coroners' courts, his habitual cheerfulness and brightness of manner were remarkable. Perhaps it was only the reaction from his work, for he had the reputation of being one of the most astute experts of the day in medical jurisprudence, and the most skilled analyst in toxicological cases on the Metropolitan Police turf. Before I could send him word that I wanted to see him, I heard the door bang, and Vandeleur came hurrying down the passage, putting on his coat as he rushed along. "Hello!" he cried. "I haven't seen you for ages. Do you want me?" "Yes, very urgently," I answered. "Are you busy?" "Head over ears, my dear chap. I cannot give you a moment now, but perhaps later on." "What is it? You look excited." "I have got to go to Eaton Square like the wind, but come along if you like, and tell me on the way." "Capital!" I cried. "The thing has been reported then. You are going to Mr. Selby's, number 34A. Then I am going with you." He looked at me in amazement. "But the case has only just been reported. What can you possibly know about it?" "Everything. Let us take this hansom, and I'll tell you as we go along." As we drove to Eaton Square, I quickly explained the situation, glancing now and then at Vandeleur's bright, clean-shaven face. He was no longer Eric Vandeleur, the man with the latest club story and a merry twinkle in his blue eyes. He was Vandeleur, the medical jurist, with a face like a mask, his lower jaw slightly protruding and features very fixed. "The thing promises to be serious," he replied as I finished, "but I can do nothing until after the autopsy. Here we are, and there is my man waiting for me. He has been smart." On the steps stood an official-looking man in uniform who saluted. "Coroner's officer," explained Vandeleur. We entered the silent, darkened house. Selby was standing in the hall. He came to meet us. I introduced him to Vandeleur, and he at once led us into the dining room, where we found Dr. Osborne, whom Selby had called in when the alarm of Edith's illness had been first given. Dr. Osborne was a pale, undersized, very young man. His face expressed considerable alarm. Vandeleur, however, managed to put him completely at his ease. "I'll have a chat with you in a few minutes, Dr. Osborne," he said, "but first I must get Mr. Selby's report. Will you please tell me, sir, exactly what occurred?" "Certainly," he answered. "We had a reception here last night, and my sister-in-law did not go to bed until early morning. She was in bad spirits, but otherwise in her usual health. My wife went into her room after she was in bed and told me later on that she had found Edith in hysterics and could not get her to explain anything. We both talked about taking her to the country without delay. Indeed, our intention was to get off this afternoon." "Well," said Vandeleur, "we had breakfast about 9:30, and Miss Dallas came down, looking quite in her usual health, and in apparently good spirits. She ate with appetite, and as it happened, she and my wife were both helped from the same dish. The meal had nearly come to end when she jumped up from the table, uttered a sharp cry, turned very pale, pressed her hand to her side, and ran out of the room. My wife immediately followed her. She came back again in a minute or two, and said that Edith was in violent pain, and begged of me to send for a doctor. Dr. Osborne lives just round the corner. He came at once, but she died almost immediately after his arrival." "You were in the room?" asked Vandeleur, turning to Osborne. "Yes," he replied. "She was conscious to the last moment, and died suddenly." "Did she tell you anything?" "No, except to assure me that she had not eaten any food that day until she had come down to breakfast. After the death occurred, I sent immediately to report the case, locked the door of the room where the poor girl's body is, and saw also that nobody touched anything on this table." Vandeleur rang the bell, and the servant appeared. He gave quick orders. The entire remains of the meal were collected and taken charge of, and then he and the coroner's officer went upstairs. When we were alone, Selby sank into a chair. His face was quite drawn and haggard. "It is the horrible suddenness of the thing which is so appalling," he cried. "As to Beatrice, I don't believe she will ever be the same again. She was deeply attached to Edith. Edith was nearly 10 years her senior, and always acted the part of mother to her. This is a sad beginning to our life." I can scarcely think collectedly. I remained with him a little longer, and then, as Vandeleur did not return, went back to my own house. There I could settle to nothing, and when Vandeleur rang me up on the telephone about 6 o'clock, I hurried off to his rooms. As soon as I arrived, I saw that Selby was with him, and the expression on both their faces told me the truth. "This is a bad business," said Vandeleur. "Miss Dallas has died from swallowing poison. An exhaustive analysis and examination have been made, and a powerful poison, unknown to European toxicologists, has been found. This is strange enough, but how it has been administered is a puzzle. I confess, at the present moment, we are all nonplussed. It certainly was not in the remains of the breakfast, and we have hard dying evidence that she took nothing else. Now a poison with such appalling potency would take effect quickly. It is evident that she was quite well when she came to breakfast, and that the poison began to work towards the close of the meal. But how did she get it? This question, however, I shall deal with later on. The more immediate point is this. The situation is a serious one in view of the monetary issues and the value of the lady's life. From the aspects of the case, her undoubted sanity and her affection for her sister, we may almost exclude the idea of suicide. We must therefore call it murder. This harmless, innocent lady is struck down by the hand of an assassin, and with such devilish cunning that no trace or clue is left behind. For such an act there must have been some very powerful motive, and the person who designed and executed it must be a criminal of the highest order of scientific ability. Mr. Selby has been telling me the exact financial position of the poor lady, and also of his own young wife. The absolute disappearance of the step-brother, in view of his previous character, is in the highest degree strange, knowing as we do that between him and the 2 million sterling there stood 2 lives. One is taken. A deadly sensation of cold seized me as Vandeleur uttered these last words. I glanced at Selby. His face was colourless, and the pupils of his eyes were contracted, as though he saw something which terrified him. "What happened once may happen again," continued Vandeleur. "We are in the presence of a great mystery, and I counsel you, Mr. Selby, to guard your wife with the utmost care." These words, falling from a man of Vandeleur's position and authority on such matters, were sufficiently shocking for me to hear. But for Selby to be given such a solemn warning about his young and beautiful and newly married wife, who was all the world to him, was terrible indeed. He leaned his head on his hands. "Mercy on us," he muttered. "Is this a civilized country, where death can walk abroad like this, invisible, not to be avoided? Tell me, Mr. Vandeleur, what I must do." "You must be guided by me," said Vandeleur, "and believe me, there is no witchcraft in the world. I shall place a detective in your household immediately. Don't be alarmed. He will come to you in plain clothes, and will simply act as a servant. Nevertheless, nothing can be done to your wife without his knowledge. As to you, Drews," he continued, turning to me, "the police are doing all they can to find this man, Silver, and I ask you to help them with your big agency, and to begin at once. Leave your friend to me. Wire instantly if you hear news." "You may rely on me," I said, and a moment later I had left the room. As I walked rapidly down the street, the thought of Madame Sara, her shop and its mysterious background, its surgical instruments, its operating table, its induction coils, came back to me. And yet, what could Madame Sara have to do with the present strange, inexplicable mystery? The thought had scarcely crossed my mind before I heard a clatter alongside the curb, and turning round, I saw a smart open carriage, drawn by a pair of horses, standing there. I also heard my own name. I turned. Bending out of the carriage was Madame Sara. "I saw you going by, Mr. Drews. I have only just heard the news about poor Edith Dallas. I am terribly shocked and upset. I have been to the house, but they would not admit me. Have you heard what was the cause of her death?" Madame's blue eyes filled with tears as she spoke. "I am not at liberty to disclose what I have heard, madam," I answered, "since I am officially connected with the affair." Her eyes narrowed. The brimming tears dried as though by magic. Her glance became scornful. "Thank you," she answered. "Your reply tells me that she did not die naturally. How very appalling! But I must not keep you. Can I drive you anywhere?" No, thank you. Goodbye then. She made a sign to the coachman, and as the carriage rolled away, turned to look back at me. Her face wore the defiant expression I had seen there more than once. Could she be connected with the affair? The thought came upon me with a violence that seemed almost conviction. Yet I had no reason for it. None. To find Henry Joachim Silva was now my principal thought. Advertisements were widely circulated. My staff had instructions to make every possible enquiry, with large money rewards as incitements. The collateral branches of other agencies throughout Brazil were communicated with by cable, and all the Scotland Yard channels were used. Still there was no result. The newspapers took up the case. There were paragraphs in most of them with regard to the missing step-brother and the mysterious death of Edith Dallas. Then someone got hold of the story of the will, and this was retailed with many additions for the benefit of the public. At the inquest, the jury returned the following verdict: "We find that Miss Edith Dallas died from taking poison of unknown name, but by whom or how administered there is no evidence to say." This unsatisfactory state of things was destined to change quite suddenly. On the 6th of August, as I was seated in my office, a note was brought me by a private messenger. It ran as follows: Norfolk Hotel, Strand. Dear Sir, I have just arrived in London from Brazil, and have seen your advertisements. I was about to insert one myself in order to find the whereabouts of my sisters. I am a great invalid, and unable to leave my room. Can you come to see me at the earliest possible moment? Yours, Henry Joachim Silva. In uncontrollable excitement, I hastily dispatched 2 telegrams, one to Selby and the other to Vandeleur, begging of them to be with me without fail as soon as possible. So the man had never been in England at all. The situation was more bewildering than ever. One thing at least was probably Edith Dallas's death was not due to her step-brother. Soon after 6:30, Selby arrived, and Vandeleur walked in 10 minutes later. I told them what had occurred and showed them the letter. In half an hour's time we reached the hotel, and on stating who I was, we were shown into a room on the first floor by Silva's private servant. Resting in an armchair, as we entered, sat a man. His face was terribly thin. The eyes and cheeks were so sunken that the face had almost the appearance of a skull. He made no effort to rise when we entered, and glanced from one of us to the other with the utmost astonishment. I at once introduced myself, and explained who we are. He then waved his hand for his man to retire. "You have not heard the news, of course, Mr. Silva," I said. "News? What?" He glanced up to me and seemed to read something in my face. He started back in his chair. "Good heavens!" he replied. "Do you allude to my sisters? Tell me quickly, are they alive?" "Your elder sister died on the 29th of July. There is every reason to believe her death was caused by foul play." As I uttered these words, the change that passed over his face was fearful to witness. He did not speak, but remained motionless. His claw-like hands clutched the arms of the chair. His eyes were fixed and staring, as though they would start from their hollow sockets. The color of his skin was like clay. I heard Selby breathe quickly behind me, and Vandeleur stepped towards the man and laid his hand on his shoulder. "Tell us what you know of this matter," he said sharply. Recovering himself with an effort, the invalid began in tremulous voice. "Listen closely, for you must act quickly. I am indirectly responsible for this fearful thing. My life has been a wild and wasted one, and now I am dying. The doctors tell me I cannot live a month, for I have a large aneurysm of the heart. 18 months ago I was in Rio. I was living fast and gambled heavily. Among my fellow gamblers was a man much older than myself. His name was Jose Arranjo. He was, if anything, a greater gambler than I. One night we played alone. The stakes ran high until they reached a big figure. By daylight I had lost to him nearly 200,000 pounds. Though I am a rich man in point of income, under my uncle's will, I could not pay a 20th part of that sum. This man knew my financial position, and in addition to a sum of 5,000 pounds paid down, I gave him a document. I must have been mad to do so. The document was this. It was duly witnessed and attested by a lawyer, that in the event of my surviving 2 sisters, and thus inheriting the whole of my uncle's vast wealth, 500,000 should go to Jose Aranjo. I felt I was breaking up at the time, and the chances of my inheriting the money were small. Immediately after the completion of the document, this man left Rio. I then heard a great deal about him that I had not previously known. He was a man of queerest antecedents, partly Indian, partly Italian. He had spent many years of his life amongst the Indians. I heard also that he was as cruel as he was clever, and possessed some wonderful secrets of poisoning unknown to the West. I thought a great deal about this, for I knew that by signing that document I had placed the lives of my two sisters between him and a fortune. I came to Para 6 weeks ago, only to learn that one of my sisters was married, and that both had gone to England. Ill as I was, I determined to follow them in order to warn them. I also wanted to arrange matters with you, Mr. Selby. One moment, sir, I broke in suddenly. Do you happen to be aware if this man, Jose Aranjo, knew a woman calling herself Madame Sara? Knew her, cried Silver. Very well indeed, and so, for that matter, did I. Aranjo and Madame Sara were the best friends, and constantly met. She called herself a professional beautifier, was very handsome, and had secrets for the pursuing of her trade unknown even to Aranjo. Good heavens, I cried, and the woman is now in London. She returned here with Mrs. Selby and Miss Dallas. Edith was very much influenced by her, and was constantly with her. There is no doubt in my mind that she is guilty. I have suspected her for some time, but I could not find a motive. Now the motive appears. You surely can have her arrested. Vandeleur made no reply. He gave me a strange look, and then he turned to Selby. Has your wife also consulted Madame Sara? He asked sharply. Yes, she went to her once about her teeth, but has not been to the shop since Edith's death. I begged of her not to see the woman, and she promised me faithfully she would not do so. Has she any medicines or lotions given to her by Madame Sara? Does she follow any line of treatment advised by her? No, I am certain on that point. Very well. I will see your wife tonight in order to ask her some questions. You must both leave town at once. Go to your country house and settle there. I am quite serious when I say that Mrs. Selby is in the utmost possible danger until after the death of her brother. We must leave you now, Mr. Silver. All business affairs must wait for the present. It is absolutely necessary that Mrs. Selby should leave London at once. Good night, sir. I shall give myself the pleasure of calling on you tomorrow morning. We took leave of the sick man. As soon as we got into the street, Vandeleur stopped. I must leave it to you, Selby, he said, to judge how much of this matter you tell your wife. Were I you, I would explain everything. The time for immediate action has arrived, and she is a brave and sensible woman. From this moment you must watch all the foods and liquids that she takes. She must never be out of your sight, or out of the sight of some other trustworthy companion. I shall of course watch my wife myself, said Selby, but the thing is enough to drive one mad. I will go with you to the country, Selby, I said suddenly. Ah, cried Vandeleur, that is the best thing possible, and what I wanted to propose. Go all of you, by an early train tomorrow. Then I will be off home at once to make arrangements, I said. I will meet you, Selby, at Waterloo for the first train to Cronsmoor tomorrow. As I was turning away, Vandeleur caught my arm. I am glad you are going with them, he said. I shall write to you tonight re-instructions. Never be without a loaded revolver. Good night. By 6:15 the next morning, Selby, his wife, and I were in a reserved, locked, first-class compartment, speeding rapidly west. The servants and Mrs. Selby's own special maid were in a separate carriage. Selby's face showed signs of a sleepless night, and presented a striking contrast to the fair, fresh face of the girl round whom this strange battle raged. Her husband had told her everything, and though still suffering terribly from the shock and grief of her sister's death, her face was calm and full of repose. A carriage was waiting for us at Cronsmoor, and by half-night we arrived at the old home of the Selbys, nestling amid its oaks and elms. Everything was done to make the home-coming of the bride as cheerful as circumstances would permit, but a gloom impossible to lift overshadowed Selby himself. He could scarcely rouse himself to take the slightest interest in anything. The following morning I received a letter from Vandeleur. It was very short, and once more impressed on me the necessity of caution. He said that two eminent physicians had examined Silver, and the verdict was that he could not live a month. Until his death, precautions must be strictly observed. The day was cloudless, and after breakfast I was just starting out for a stroll when the butler brought me a telegram. I tore it open. It was from Vandeleur. "Prohibit all food until I arrive. I am coming down," were the words. I hurried into the study and gave it to Selby. He read it and looked up at me. "Find out the first train and go and meet him, old chap," he said. "Let us hope that this means an end of the hideous affair." I went into the hall and looked up the trains. The next arrived at Cronsmore at 10:45. I then strolled round to the stables and ordered a carriage, after which I walked up and down on the drive. There was no doubt that something strange had happened. Vandeleur coming down so suddenly must mean a final clearing up of the mystery. I had just turned round at the lodge gates to wait for the carriage when the sound of wheels and horses galloping struck on my ears. The gates were swung open, and Vandeleur in an open fly dashed through them. Before I could recover from my surprise, he was out of the vehicle and at my side. He carried a small black bag in his hand. "I came down by special train," he said, speaking quickly. "There is not a moment to lose. Come at once. Is Mrs. Selby all right?" "What do you mean?" I replied. "Of course she is. Do you suppose that she is in danger?" "Deadly," was his answer. "Come." We dashed up to the house together. Selby, who had heard our steps, came to meet us. "Mr. Vandeleur," he cried, "what is it? How did you come?" "By special train, Mr. Selby, and I want to see your wife at once. It will be necessary to perform a very trifling operation." "Operation!" he exclaimed. "Yes, at once." We made our way through the hall and into the morning room, where Mrs. Selby was busily engaged reading and answering letters. She started up when she saw Vandeleur and uttered an exclamation of surprise. "What has happened?" she asked. Vandeleur went up to her and took her hand. "Do not be alarmed," he said, "for I have come to put all your fears to rest. Now please listen to me. When you visited Madame Sara with your sister, did you go for medical advice?" The colour rushed into her face. "One of my teeth ached," she answered. "I went to her about that. She is, as I suppose you know, a most wonderful dentist. She examined the tooth, found that it required stopping, and got an assistant, a Brazilian, I think, to do it." "And your tooth has been comfortable ever since?" "Yes, quite. She had one of it stopped at the same time." "Will you kindly sit down and show me which was the tooth into which the stopping was put?" She did so. "This was the one," she said, pointing with her finger to one in the lower jaw. "What do you mean? Is there anything wrong?" Vandeleur examined the tooth long and carefully. There was a sudden rapid movement of his hand, and a sharp cry from Mrs. Selby. With the deftness of long practice and a powerful wrist, he had extracted the tooth with one wrench. The suddenness of the whole thing, startling as it was not so strange as his next movement. "Send Mrs. Selby's maid to her," he said, turning to her husband. "Then come both of you into the next room." The maid was summoned. Poor Mrs. Selby had sunk back in her chair, terrified and half fainting. A moment later Selby joined us in the dining room. "That's right," said Vandeleur. "Close the door, will you?" He opened his black bag and brought out several instruments. With one he removed the stopping from the tooth. It was quite soft and came away easily. Then from the bag he produced a small guinea pig, which he requested me to hold. He pressed the sharp instrument into the tooth, and opening the mouth of the little animal, placed a point on the tongue. The effect was instantaneous. The little head fell onto one of my hands. The guinea pig was dead. Vandeleur was white as a sheet. He hurried up to Selby and wrung his hand. "Thank heaven," he said. "I have been in time, but only just. Your wife is safe. This stopping would hardly have held another hour. I have been thinking all night over the mystery of your sister-in-law's death, and over every minute detail of evidence as to how the poison could have been administered. Suddenly the coincidence of both sisters having had their teeth stopped struck me as remarkable. Like a flash the solution came to me. The more I considered it, the more I felt that I was right. But by what fiendish cunning such a scheme could have been conceived and executed is beyond my power to explain. The poison is very like hyoscine, one of the worst toxic alkaloids known, so violent in its deadly proportions that the amount that would go into a tooth would cause almost instant death. It has been kept in by a gutta percha stopping, certain to come out within a month, probably earlier, and most probably during mastication of food. The person would die either immediately or after a very few minutes, and no one would connect a visit to the dentist with a death a month afterwards. What followed can be told in a very few words. Madame Sara was arrested on suspicion. She appeared before the magistrate, looking innocent and beautiful, and managed, during her evidence, completely to baffle that acute individual. She denied nothing, but declared that the poison must have been put into the tooth by one of the two Brazilians whom she had lately engaged to help her with her dentistry. She had her suspicions with regard to these men soon afterwards, and had dismissed them. She believed that they were in the pay of Joe's arranger, but she could not tell anything for certain. Thus Madame escaped conviction. I was certain that she was guilty, but there was not a shadow of real proof. A month later Silva died, and Selby is now a double millionaire. End of Madame Sara by L. T. Meade and Robert Eustache, Part 2.